Hello and welcome back to Grammar Fundamentals. It's a great pleasure to have you back with us. And now that we've covered a lot of the fundamentals of verb tenses, we're ready to move on to some other fundamentals. So let's start with something that's little, tricky, and also super important, prepositions. And where better to start than in, on, and at. These are really tricky for most people I talk to. And the best way to explain them is to talk about space and time. So let's do it. First, starting with in space. So when we talk about in, we can think of it as 3D, meaning a bigger space, and also when that space is 3D, meaning when we talk about states, countries, neighborhoods, bigger spaces, and also when we are inside of them. For example, I have lived in Brazil since 2007. I live now in the state of Santa Catarina. Before I lived in Rio Grande do Sul. I now live in Itapema, in a rural neighborhood. Right now, I live in a house. We are in my backyard. Okay? Makes sense? Cool. Let's move on to on. In space, we're talking about 2D space. In other words, surface level and things that are flat. So we're really usually talking about streets and also when we're on the surface of things. For example, I live on Silver Street. We're driving on the street. A plane will land on the runway. That's why we say the book is on the table, because it's on that surface. Okay? Perfect. Now let's look at. Now at we can think of as 1D, meaning a very specific point, usually an address or a very specific point maybe on the map. Or when we're talking about at, we're talking about a very specific point. For example, the address. I live at 2024 Silver Street. I'm going to meet you at the mall. I'm going to meet you at that store. Meet me at my house. That's that specific place. I'm going to meet you at the corner, meaning that point where the two streets come together. So at is that point, 1D. Okay? Now we're ready to move on to time. Let's first look at in time. So again, in we can think of as the biggest amount of time, meaning, for example, a year, a month, a time of day. So for example, I was born in 1978. I was born in the month of June. We can also talk about right now a time of day. It can be in the morning, in the afternoon. The exception is at night, which we'll talk about. But we can say in the evening. So a bigger amount of time is going to be in, right? Now when we talk about time a little smaller, we're going to say on, because on is more specific than in. And when we talk about on time, first of all, on time means that we're at the right time. And on time, we're talking about days and dates. So this is important. We're going to say, I'm going to meet you on Monday, on Tuesday, on Wednesday. I'm also going to meet you on the specific date. So on January 1st, on February 2nd, on March 3rd. Okay? Perfect. That's how we use on. And at is a very specific time. So we had in, bigger, on, more specific. At is the most specific, which is that exact time. So I'm going to meet you at 7 o'clock. I'm going to meet you at 5:55. I'm going to meet you at that specific time. And like I said, that exception to the rule there is at night. Why? Because it is. We know that sometimes there's no explanation. But in general, a time of day is in except for at night. Okay? Wonderful. So, as always, it's important for us to use these rules. It's great to know things, but again, common knowledge is not common practice. So how do we actually start really learning in, on, and at is to use them, to practice, 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 practice. So let me give you just a couple ways to practice in, on, and at. So number one, why don't you talk about where you were born? Then you can use the ideas of in, on, and at for space. So number one, say where you were born. I was born in Brazil. I was born in this city, on this street, at this time. Yeah, you could even use some time. Okay, so talk about exactly where you were born. Number two, let's talk about when you were born. I gave you some examples of this, but this is a great way to just be able to remember quickly the rules of in, on, or at. So think about your birthday. I was born in June. I was born on a Monday. I was born at 10 at night, right? What is your birth date? I was born on June 1st, right? So go ahead and talk about your birthday, exactly when you were born, and you'll be able to remember and practice in, on, and at. And number three, let's do a little more practice talking about where you work. Give some information, and again, doing a nice review of all of your in, on, or at. In this case, you can say at the address. My building is at this address. I work in this office. Also, maybe there are floors. That's a perfect way. A floor is on. I work on the 5th floor, on the 6th floor. My office is next to, if you want to practice some of those prepositions. But this is a great way just describing your office. So again, number one, where you were born. Number two, when you were born. And number three, where you work. A great way to practice, practice, practice. Put in, on, and at into practice. Great. It's such a pleasure to talk with you as always, and hopefully that cleared up some of that trickiness about in, on, and at. And in the next Grammar Fundamentals, we'll keep getting to the fundamentals and figuring out how to make it easier, smoother, and practice, practice, practice. It's always such a pleasure to talk with you, and talk with you very soon. Much light and love. Ciao, ciao.